would also, I think, be very helpful if the officials were able to share with the Oireachtas committee a response to how they dealt with the very considerable legal concerns that the OPLA had. I know you don't have the legal advice because it's confidential to the committee, but I'm sure we're able to provide you either with a summary of it or with the agreement of the committee, a copy of it, given that it's the government, because I think the committee would like to be reassured of that. Just 2 points, because we have very little time left. I just want to make the case, a good water abstraction regime is good for everybody. It's good for the small farmer. It's good for rural communities. It's good for large urban areas. It's good for businesses. And the reason why is because Deputy McGrath made a very important point, which is actually an argument for an abstraction regime. We're entering into an era where we're having more adverse weather events, droughts and reduction in water supply from the natural water courses Deputy McGrath mentioned, but also floods. And obviously that's a direct consequence both of climate change and the mismanagement historically of our natural water system. And therefore, if we want to ensure people have access to that vital national resource, first thing we have to do is we have to be able to measure it. We have to know what's happening. This isn't about stopping anybody accessing anything. It's about making sure that on the basis of the priorities that we set as a society, those people who most need access to the natural resource of the water systems, whether they be people, whether they be businesses, whether they be ecosystems and the natural environment, get access to that. And, you know, it is important to remember what the thresholds are. So the Minister is right. 95% water abstractions will be registered. But all that means is they'll be registered. They won't be licensed and they won't be monitored. The only abstractions that will be required to be licensed are abstractions above 2,000 cubic metres per day. That's equivalent to the daily water uses of 18,000 people. That's not big, that's enormous, right? And that's not cumulative abstractions beside each other, that's single abstractions. That actually means that the vast majority of abstractions, including large abstractions, won't be captured by the licensing, won't be monitored by the Environmental Protection Agency, and therefore we won't be managing it properly. And I absolutely share Deputy Matthews' view, which is if we don't account for the abstraction, we won't be able to manage into the future, particularly as the impacts of climate change become more adverse. Who will be the big losers of that, first of all? Actually, it'll be rural communities in the first instance. It'll be people more dependent on the land for their livelihood than those of us who live in the big urban centres. It will be the small family farms and more isolated rural areas, and it will roll on from there. So the argument that a threshold of 2,000 cubic metres is an appropriate one isn't the case. And it became patently clear during the committee sessions why that threshold has been set. Because if you set it any lower, you have to resource the Environmental Protection Agency better. That's really the argument, and that would mean staff and resources. What I would urge the Minister to do is to convey to his colleagues that, given that the threshold is going to be the threshold, we have to make sure that at least that at a minimum is properly policed and managed. And therefore, and again, we won't get to the other amendments, but in terms of decisions on licensing, decisions on exemptions, decisions on the continuation of historic abstractions, they have to be made in a way that's absolutely consistent with the Water Framework Directive. And just to respond in a very collegiate way to Deputy McGrath and Deputy Fitzmaurice, I'm an exceptionally strong critic of many aspects of European integration. But just because something has its origins in the European Union doesn't mean that it doesn't have a value. And nobody can accuse the Irish government of rushing the abstraction legislation. Deputy O'Callaghan outlined the 20-year wait to get us here. This is an eminently sensible and urgently required regime if we get it right. So all I would urge you to do, Minister, is in whatever way you can, convey the sentiments of people here, which is to have an abstraction regime, to have one that works, to have one that protects urban and rural communities, businesses, and crucially the natural environment and our biodiversity. And let's not be coming back here in a number of years' time with amending legislation at the last minute because we're open to yet another European infringement proceeding and millions of euros of taxpayers' money is being wasted when we could have fixed the problem this time around.